Number 1.
Northern California's Emerald Triangle is considered to be one of America's most beautiful areas. But it's also a hotspot for missing persons reports, making it one of the most treacherous as well. Last month, the host of the podcast Murder, She Told dived into the unsolved murder of Danielle Bertolini. She is one of 5 women who make up the Humboldt Five. Jennifer Wilmer, Karen Mitchell, Christine Walters and Sheila Franks are the other 4. The Humboldt Five is a group of women that have kind of been clumped together as young women who all have similar looks, similarish backstories, that have gone missing or been found murdered in the same are. Kristen Sive, the host of Murder, She Told us via phone interview. A woman named them this to bring attention to how many missing people there are, she explained. Catchy names get people's attention. True crime investigator Billy Jensen, who wrote about the 5 missing women in his book Chase Darkness with Me, how one true crime writer started solving murders, credits missing persons activist Brenda Condon for coining the name. Their cases span between the 1990s and 2014, and while some might be connected, namely Franks and Bertolini, Sive doesn't suspect they all are. Sive actually grew up with Bertolini in Maine, and her 2-part podcast episode on the case explores Bertolini's love of the outdoors as well as personal trauma she suffered. Her mother Billie Jo describes she lost her unborn son Xavier in 2010. As Jensen writes in his book, a doctor determined that the boy had severe developmental issues and would not survive. Bertolini underwent emergency surgery to terminate the pregnancy, an event that changed her. She then turned to heroin for self-medication and immediately fled to the refuge of Humboldt County for a change. Bertolini vanished in 2014 at age 24 in the idyllic California region known for its picturesque redwood forests, but also illegal activity, violence, and hosts of missing people. Humboldt County is one of 3 counties that makes up the so-called Emerald Triangle, an area famous for marijuana cultivation, both legal and black market. It's an area that has long attracted people looking to get closer to nature, or sometimes, to escape. Bertolini trimmed marijuana crops on a mountain for 4 years before she disappeared. Jennifer Wilmer, 21, was the first of the 5 to vanish. She grew up in Long Island and moved to Humboldt in 1992. She had planned to enroll in College of the Redwoods, but the classes were booked up, so she began waitressing and looking for other work in the meantime. She was last spotted in Willow Creek in September 1993. Foul play is suspected. Karen Mitchell, 16, disappeared 4 years later, in November 1997 in Eureka. The local teen attended school in the area and worked at Coastal Family Development Center. She was known for having liberal views and was passionate about politics and the environment. She was possibly last seen getting into a light blue 4-door sedan, according to the Charlie Project, an organization that compiles information about thousands of missing persons cases. Robert Durst, a suspected serial killer who has been linked to 3 deaths, was spotted in the area months later, and the Charlie Project speculates that his likeness matches a sketch of the driver of that sedan. He has not been ruled out as a possible suspect, The Guardian reported in 2015. In November 2008, Christine Walters, a 23-year-old Wisconsin native, vanished shortly after walking out of a copy store in Eureka. Just 1 week earlier, she was found bloodied and bruised on a doorstep, begging the residents to bring her to a hospital for help, according to her missing poster. She was a junior at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, where she studied both botany and ethnobotany. She also taught pilates and yoga, according to the Charlie Project. She was visiting friends in the area, and Weiland had become interested in spirituality and environmental causes. Sheila Franks, 37, vanished in Eureka in 2014, just 7 days before Bertolini did. The 2 are the only ones of the 5 who have been found, tragically in the form of partial remains. Bertolini's skull was discovered in 2015 north of Rio Del. Police have determined she died by homicide. A femur bone belonging to Franks was located near Loletta at the mouth of the Eel River, just 13 miles away from Bertolini's skull, in 2019. Her death is considered suspicious. Both women had blonde hair and blue eyes and were of similar appearance and build, Maine's Bangor Daily News pointed out in 2014. The link between the two cases is a man named Jim Jones. Bertolini was last seen being given a ride by Jones, a person of interest in her case. Jones also lived with Franks, a divorced mom, when she vanished, NBC News reports. They were reportedly dating. No arrests have ever been made. Sive has created an online petition which calls for more action on Franks and Bertolini's case. She wants investigators to re-interview Jones, to provide a public update on the case, and speak to witnesses once again. While the 5 cases have received some attention, it hasn't been a lot compared to other missing persons cases. Sive attributes that to the women's profiles. The area attracts a lot of free spirits, I think is a good word for it, and because of that it's easy for the media to write them off as either somebody who was asking for it or somebody who got wrapped up into drugs or the wrong crowd, she told us. I think that's definitely the case for Danielle. If you're a sex worker, if you're into drugs, you're painted in a different light and people just don't care as much. She also thinks that the general hesitancy among the region's residents to talk to law enforcement, due to the criminal element that's existed there for decades, is a contributing factor. That, and the fact that some people who move to the area are looking for an escape. A lot of people do go voluntarily missing too, Sive said. People who want to go off the grid. This makes it harder when you have tons of people who go there to go off the grid, and their family goes into a panic cause they can't contact them, and investigators spend time on those cases, and it puts other cases on the back burner. She said that local authorities have limited resources. She hopes to apply pressure to solve the cases by bringing some of them into the spotlight, like her childhood friend's death. My hope is that other people will hear her story through her mother's words, and that they will have more compassion or a different understanding for people who are in a similar situation or who fell into a downward spiral and can't get out instead of just reacting by saying don't do drugs, she said. Seaver hopes that people see elements of themselves in these women. I want to feature stories of people who aren't getting talked about, she said. All victims should get justice.
Number 2.
Paul and Billy look into the 1970 murders of Colette MacDonald and her 2 young daughters in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Colette's husband, a surgeon and former Green Beret Jeffrey MacDonald, was eventually convicted of the murders but has always maintained his innocence. With the help of filmmaker and podcaster Mark Smerling from The Jinx and Morally Indefensible, the guys look into a case riddled with confessions and betrayal. Jeffrey MacDonald and his wife moved to Fort Bragg in July 1969. The two were high school sweethearts who had married in 1963 after learning Colette was pregnant with their first child. By the time they moved to North Carolina, they had 2 young daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen. February 16, 1970, the family had a normal evening. Jeffrey and Colette had watched some TV after the girls went to bed. Then Colette went to bed. Jeffrey stayed up watching a late-night talk show and fell asleep on the couch. At 3:42 a.m. on February 17, the normal evening had devolved into something sinister. The military police were called to what they thought was a domestic disturbance at 544 Castle Drive. During the call, Dr. Jeffrey MacDonald had described the incident as a stabbing. It was cold and pouring rain. The home was occupied by the young Army surgeon and former Green Beret and his growing family. His wife Colette was over 4 months pregnant with their first son. Colette's body, with an injured Jeffrey, was on the floor in the master bedroom. Her injuries were extensive. Her body was lying face up on the bedroom floor. There was blood all around her. She'd been stabbed and beaten. 21 stab wounds with an ice pick and multiple times with a knife. She'd been hit with a club, crushing her arms and skull. 5-year-old Kimberly was discovered in her bed, beaten and stabbed. The right side of her face was caved in from being clubbed. She was stabbed 7 to 8 times, mainly in the neck. 2-year-old Kristen was stabbed over 30 times with a knife and ice pick. Most of the wounds in her chest and back. Her injuries left her bed soaked with blood. Then there were Jeffrey's injuries. He had 1 stab wound on his left chest that partially collapsed his lung. But aside from that, he had small abrasions on his face and neck and a mild concussion. Eventually, Jeffrey MacDonald went to trial for the murders of his family. But it wasn't until 9 years later. Shortly before the trial, he'd ask author Joe McGinnis to tell his story. The two became fast friends, and Jeffrey thought the book would clear his name. However, after his guilty conviction and his sentence of 3 consecutive life sentences, Joe wasn't sure he could clear his name. After sitting in the courtroom and seeing the evidence, McGinnis agreed with the jury that Jeffrey MacDonald had killed his wife and 2 daughters. When the book was published, MacDonald sued McGinnis and won a settlement of over $300,000. Jeffrey MacDonald is currently in a federal prison continuing to serve his sentence. He is supposed to have a parole hearing sometime this year. He maintains his innocence.
Number 3.
In July 2017, authorities received a 911 call about a terrible fire at a rural home in Lacombe, Louisiana. After a long and arduous fight with the flames, firefighters finally gained access to the building only to find 49-year-old teacher Nanette Krentel burned beyond recognition. Investigation discoveries still a mystery. Southern Secrets showcases the brutal slaying and portrays how a death that was initially considered an accident turned into a full-fledged homicide investigation. Let's dig into the details of the case and find out more, shall we? Born in New Orleans, 49 years old Nanette Krentel served as a pre-kindergarten teacher before her retirement. She resided in Lacombe in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, with her local fire chief husband, Steve Krentel. Although the couple reportedly had a rocky marriage, their lives were relatively peaceful and quiet. The morning of July 14, 2017, started as a typical one for Nanette as she kept herself occupied and even drove out to a local McDonald's for breakfast. According to reports, she was last heard from when she placed a call at around 1:30 p.m. that afternoon. Approximately an hour later, authorities received a 911 call about the fire from one of Nanette's neighbors and rushed to the scene. Even her husband was present on the scene with his unit and helped bring the flames under control. Once the residence was safe to enter, officers went in and were exposed to the shocking sight of Nanette lying dead in the master bedroom. Nanette had suffered severe burns and was almost unrecognizable. Additionally, authorities also discovered that fire had claimed the lives of the couple's pets. Although the initial investigation did point towards the death being homicide, investigators soon made a startling discovery. For starters, traces of fire accelerant were found throughout the house, hinting strongly at the possibility of the fire being intentional. Moreover, even after suffering severe external burns, there was no soot inside Nanette's lungs, indicating that she was killed before the fire engulfed her body. Additionally, a medical examination discovered that Nanette had been shot in her temple and had died as a result of the bullet wound. Thus, the death was ruled to be a homicide, and the police put their efforts towards finding the killer. Unfortunately, Nanette Krentel's murder remains unsolved to this day, although the police are determined to reach a conclusion soon. As the case was initially not treated as a homicide, the investigation was hampered and thus delayed. However, once authorities launched a murder investigation, they went through several witness statements, reviewed hours upon hours of surveillance footage, and executed numerous search warrants. However, every single lead headed to a dead end, giving the police one setback after the other. On the other hand, the destruction of all forensic evidence in the fire also hindered the investigation. According to the show, the police did not leave any stone unturned and considered Nanette's stepson and brother-in-law as persons of interest. However, looking into their whereabouts at the time of the murder, authorities noticed that they had rock-solid alibis, which indicated their innocence. Considering the couple's rocky marriage, Steve was also looked into, but provided officers with a tight alibi. Arguably, the police thought they had a breakthrough when they discovered that Nanette had written an email to her father a few weeks before her death claiming that someone was stalking her and the property. The show mentioned that Nanette also alleged she was being followed as she found hints of someone having been on the property. However, even the email led nowhere as the police were unable to track down the man in question. With no other clues or leads to follow, the case has practically become dormant, although it remains active. Determined to find Nanette's killers, her family has also started their own independent investigation into the murder. In 2020, District Attorney Warren Montgomery subpoenaed the Sheriff's Department to hand him a complete copy of the case along with records of every investigation. However, there have been no further updates or reports on the subject since then, which makes it safe to assume that the murder is still being looked into. With Nanette's loved ones still waiting for the closure they rightly deserve, we hope the case will reach a swift conclusion in the near future.